Welcome back to another episode of Science of the Strike. My name is Corbin Healy, and I'm joined with my co-host Sam Huckabee. This is a podcast that is dedicated to taking a more scientific, analytical approach to the sport of bass fishing. You can find our content on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, anywhere that you find your podcasts. We have a very special treat for our listeners for our 10th episode today. With us in the recording studio here, we have a 23-year-old young gun from Mount Carmel, Illinois, who has absolutely taken the Major League Fishing by storm. Just some of his accomplishments here I've got to go through. First of all, I think it's important to know that this guy did not start tournament fishing until 1 year before college, okay? He qualified for the MLF College Fishing Championship every year that he had the chance. Placed third in the 2022 and 2023 Toyota Series Championship. He was the 2023 Toyota Series Plains Division Angler of the Year and run-up for the Invitationals Rookie of the Year. He made his Bass Pro Tour debut with a third-place finish on Stage 1 at Toledo Bend and continued to turn heads his rookie year by winning Stage 5 on the Cowan River in 2024. He capped off the 2024 season as the 2024 Bass Pro Tour Rookie of the Year. He had a fourth place finish in the 2024 Bass Pro Tour standings, eighth in the 2025 Heavy Hitters Tournament, third place finish for the 2025 Bass Pro Tour standings. He has multiple majors wins to his names, career winnings approaching $1 million. He's a force to be reckoned with. It's a pleasure to have him on the show. Give a warm welcome to Drew Gill, everyone. Woo!
Drew, did you know all that?
I tell you what, man, it's one of those things like, to be able to believe it, you'd almost have to sit down and read it over and over again and like affirm to yourself, like, oh, and that's all real, because it sounds like fantasy stat. It sounds like something that, like, in my mind, it's like I'm just logging into 2K and I'm seeing this player that I built that I've been playing as for this
such a short career too.
It doesn't feel like me, So it's one of those things where it's you got to pinch yourself. For sure.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Well, hey, so for our listeners, Drew, we know that you have made appearances on several podcasts for good reason. But tonight, we're taking a completely different approach to this. We want to take a scientific approach. We want all of our content tonight to be supported by science. And so we're really going to be focusing with you on comparing and contrasting the scientific studies that Sam and I have read and researched and gone over in our previous episodes with your experience on the water. You have absolutely infinitely more experience than 99.9% of people on Earth. And so we want to hear if you agree with the science and hear your point of view on a lot of stuff. And so I think Sam's going to kick us off with a question from our fifth episode regarding hearing in lateral line.
Yep. All right, Drew. So Dr. Don McCoy from the University of Kentucky and Dr. Keith Jones, which are two respected doctors of science in the fishing world, have found that bass can hear from a range of 0 to 600 hertz, with a peak sensitivity being around 100 hertz. Widespread discussion on either way if bass can feel or hear sonar, but we know for context that live scope frequencies are from 530 to 1100 kilohertz. So that's over 500,000 hertz. You commented on our post saying, I definitely agree. Bass are very aware of your boat, but to suggest they are sonar sensitive is based in black magic and heebie-jeebies. I love that comment. That was a great way to end that. So I opened the question up to you. Do you feel like bass can hear or feel sonar? I kind of have an idea of what you're going to say here. But then also, how close will you approach fish with your sonar on, with your live scope on? How far out are you setting that? How far are you trying to see them when you're making a cast, trying to control that if you can?
Yeah, 100%. So when it comes to bass and their reaction to sonar, their reaction to noise, obviously we've got to take those numbers of what bass respond to, what they're willing to, or not what they're willing to, but what they're capable of receiving. Those are pretty hard and fast numbers. I think there's some science here that's left to be debated in different topics, but in terms of what they can and can't hear, that's like describing things we can't hear that a dog can hear. What we can and can't hear is not up to our willingness to hear it. And so to kind of ascertain, yes, obviously if a bass could, it would want to hear the sonar. It would want to be able to know when we're looking at it, when we're not. But in terms of just the sheer science and the numbers, it says they can't. And from my experience on the water, I have found that to be extremely true, because here's the situation. Okay. And you can go back, look through, vet anything I'm saying by going back and watching live footage. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of times where we have our scope screen on live. And when we don't, you can still see how far I'm fishing from the boat. So when we're in dirty water fisheries versus clean water fisheries, you see, even in pressured scenarios, there's times where we fish dirty water where we're fishing around a million other boats, Okeechobee,
Yeah.
fishing, on anywhere on the Tennessee River where you've got some off color water, some stained water, anywhere, anytime that you're fishing in a real tight crowd in terms of only a certain part of the fishery is productive. Like when we go to more river type tournaments, those tournaments, there's tons of boat pressure. There's boats all around them all the time. People pointing scope around everywhere. And yet those fish are willing to engage with your bait and bite it. I had a 6-pounder that I caught, and this was not the only fish I've ever done this with. This is just a specific example that was on live this year. I had a 6-pounder at the Kissimmee chain that I caught this year that I took my boat. I trolled over that fish in 2 feet of water, saw it swim under my boat, gave it the time to get behind me, spun the boat around and caught it. 6-pounder in 2 feet of water. Took the trolling motor dead over. Pointed scope at it the whole time to follow it and move. And yet you take that same approach to a clean body of water. You try to make that same interaction with that fish occur, and you end up with a wildly different result.
Sure.
And regardless of that distance or that noise, I really don't think that I say don't think from just numbers. I mean, if we're talking science, we're talking we're really where science becomes valuable to us is, can we take it and can we apply it and it prove true in the scenario? And over time, it's just not in terms of experimentation. It has never proved true to me that they're hearing the transducer and that they're reacting to it, because dirty water, clean water, that sound is going to move in the same manner. Yes, there might be some particulate, but that's not overall changing the way that sound moves and the way the sound acts. Your beam validity is pretty much the same range wise regardless. And in clean water, you don't have that same reaction. And in clean water, it's different based on the light levels and things of that manner. And so all those interactions, all those different situations you're having occur in a day's time, you got to pay attention to them, and you got to really, take the variables that are present in one situation and compare them to another and try and figure out why that interaction changed. And knowing that the sound technology, the technology they use to deploy that sound to produce a beam of sound and receive that signal back and compute it through the computer, that system's the same. The transducer is not thinking about what the water clarity is.
Right.
And yet you can apply that in both situations and end up with wildly different results, even though the science doesn't change with the sound. Tells me that the factor that matters more than anything is visibility, not the sound of the transducer. And if we're just comparing occurrences to occurrences,
right,
I don't think there's any undertone whatsoever to fish interacting with the sound of your transducer. And I will go one step further to say that a lot of the individuals that have said, especially early on, that have said they were seeing fish react to their sonar, react to their transducer, were saying it to get people to look away from the fish, because it always came with the advice, the tagline on the end. What I do, I just point at them and then I look away. They're not just telling you what they think the fish do. They're trying to give you advice on how to fish for them. And anytime somebody's giving me unsolicited advice on how to fish for fish, I take that with a grain of salt.
Fair
because
enough.
as a competitive angler, I know that a lot of what I do rides on me being able to do the best that I can and take the best route to success that I can and repeat it. And if I'm constantly, if everybody's just willy-nilly giving out that information without anybody even asking for it, I'm going to question the honesty of that statement when somebody's giving you that advice without you ever asking for it. So I really think this is one that's definitely a hoax.
Yeah,
For sure.
That's
For
awesome.
sure.
Okay, just a quick follow-up on that. So we talked a lot about noise right there. There's always the question of starting up your motor around fish, especially that are schooled up offshore, that type of thing, and you're floating around them. What is your thought on that? Do you ever troll out of areas, before you start up your motor? Like, how do you deal with that?
So, I mean, from our perspective as tournament anglers, a lot of us do have scope installed
Yeah.
on our boats in a manner where we can use it while our motor is in gear. You see a different response from fish when your motor is in gear than when it is not. And really, a big part of that kind of comes down to how deep are the fish? Are they in a depth where they're comfortable? And really, a lot of it comes down to, do they feel like you can't see them? And if they're in a depth where they're comfortable, that response to the sound of your motor, they have a response regardless.
Okay.
Right.
Your motor, the sound of your outboard affects them. But what it does to them, it just depends on the scenario. So if they're in deep enough water to be comfortable, and they have freedom of movement in their environment, meaning you're not doing this in a creek, you're doing it in open water,
Yeah.
they're often more curious than they are skeptical about your outboard noise.
Okay.
Most
Okay.
of the time, they show interest. So this was something that's very true for me with smallmouth. In practice, one thing that you can do, or pre-practice, fun fishing, whatever, doing that is, heck, there's times where I can leave my motor it on running. I mean, maybe it's a neutral, maybe it's not in gear, but I can leave it running and catch those fish after they come up to look at my boat. Like, it's incredible.
Wow.
And so there was a Toyota Series Championship on Table Rock in 2023. And in that tournament, I caught most of my weight across 3 days, intentionally trolling over fish and using the sound of the boat to call them up. Meaning, in
How
this one,
interesting.
because we couldn't fish at the time, we couldn't fish with the motor even in neutral.
Yeah.
I would actually use the speakers in my boat, and I would turn them up. Like, I'd have my phone in my pocket, and I'd turn it up as I trolled over a fish, and I had the bass bumped all the way up where the boat would vibrate, and you could call them up to the sound of the boat and drop back off the back end of the boat and catch
So
them.
interesting.
And
That's very interesting. Yeah. That's
using
also
sound is something that can be very effective to piquing their curiosity if you're in the right scenario. If you're in the wrong scenario, let's say you're in a creek in 3 foot of water, their response is almost always adverse. They're going to spook. They're going to get out of the way because they feel concerned for their safety.
Okay.
But I think
Interesting.
a big part of it, like, and that's, you can go into the weeds really deep here, but bass is pretty high on the food chain, its environment. A lot of places, they don't have a natural aquatic predator. And so a bass is generally pretty comfortable, and it's generally very curious.
Yeah.
And so a lot of those behaviors, unless you corner them and put them in a situation where they have to fear for their own safety, they generally don't. And so a lot of times with sound, bass don't tend to show spooky behaviors often. They tend to show curiosity, and then they become disinterested in whatever it is. But in
Sure.
terms of being spooky, often they aren't spooky. Most of the time, they're more interested in you than they are disinterested from the get-go. So with sound, there's times where you can kind of weaponize it, but most of the time, they're more curious about your sound than they are afraid.
Drew, you're going to
interesting.
have everybody bumping out there.
Yeah, no kidding. You also just made a lot of people in our comments very happy because this is contrary to what we've read scientifically. I mean, I'm not disputing what you've said, but we've had a lot of people who have commented on our videos that on the science that seems to suggest otherwise, who have suggested what you just said, and so that's really interesting. So I want to move on to another question that has kind of been a hot button topic, and it's kind of both between the barometer and the moon. And I know those are different, but they're kind of one and the same in the way that we've approached them and honestly, the science on it. So with the barometer, there's really a lack of research that we've been able to find that suggests that barometric pressure has an impact on largemouth bass fishing at all. There was a 2017 article that was written by In Fisherman, which is certainly not what we usually analyze, that was titled Barometric Pressure in Bass Fishing by a guy named Ralph Manns. And he was quoted saying, "We await any scientific information or interpretation that better explains the relationship between gamefish behavior and changes in air pressure when isolated from the confounding effects of weather conditions. Until a biologically reasonable mechanism is proposed, we think it's more reasonable and likely more accurate to consider weather and sky conditions rather than barometric pressure in explaining fish activity inactivity." You have experience in literally every weather condition possible and the hugest variety of barometer. What would you say? How do you approach the barometer, if at all?
The barometer, follows, although it's not parallel, it follows a lot of the trends that occur with weather. Obviously, the air pressure
Yeah.
changes depending
Right.
on the temperature of the air mass,
Right.
and depending on the pressure that is exerted by the density of that air mass. So, it's one of those things where the same occurrences are going to show on the barometer that are occurring in the weather.
Right.
And so the barometer might give you some sort of a general idea of what's happening with the air pressure, but the air pressure itself, the fish do, in my opinion, do not listen to the air pressure that is exerted on the surface of the water,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Yep.
Most of their reactions are based on when they have the opportunity to feed, based on light level and based on influxes of nutrients in the environment through rainwater, snowmelt, whatever it may be. I think most of those responses are generated by bass taking the opportunity when it's most convenient for them to feed, and their response as a result is, when they go from a situation where it's very, very convenient or it's very potentially successful for them to feed to a time period where it is not, in terms of light level, in terms of surface clarity and things like that, they're just going to shift. They're going to change. Fish do change with the environment because the environment is all they have. Like, they live in the water. They are affected by light level, and those things. And so, really, I think it's all weather driven. I don't care what the barometer says,
Yep.
nor do
Okay.
I pay much attention to a person.
Good to know. Well, the follow up question to that, and we actually had Mr. Brian Latimer in our comments today on the moon, and I kind of same type of question. It's the same deal. Where there's not the research that we found actually suggests that bass behave kind of contrarily or opposite how one might anticipate with the approaching of a full moon, and that there's little science, if any, to suggest any correlation between a full moon or a new moon and a better bite or anything like that. And Mr. Latimer agreed. What is your opinion on that? Do you track the moon at all?
The only, really, the only time I pay any attention to what the moon is doing is when I feel like there's a strong correlation between what the moon is doing and how it pertains to forage, not to the bass themselves.
Interesting.
So the only time I'm ever going to pay any attention to the moon is when the moon generates some level of forage activity that occurs at night, that
Okay.
occurs in low light levels. So meaning a few of your bait fish, not all of them, but a couple of them seem to be affected very heavily by the moon and by the presence of that high visibility at night. And so it causes the forage to act different, meaning they change how they act during the day because of how they're acting at night.
Right.
So the only time I ever pay attention to the moon is when it's forage related. I don't pay attention to it directly between the moon makes a largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass do this. The
Yeah.
moon might make the forage do this, which might make the bass do something, but that's pretty isolated and really seems to only happen very heavily for me around bait fish spawns. And for some reason, I'm not even going to make a wide blanket, seem to play some sort of a role, from what I've seen, on pelagic bait fish in the late winter, early spring.
Interesting.
Bait fish that move and migrate a lot throughout a period of time, meaning like alewife and herring. I don't see it happen as much with shad, but alewife and herring seem to be more predictable and findable in those late or in those early morning hours, whenever you have a lot of visibility at night. I don't know why the correlation's there that time of year,
Sure.
because that's not bait fish spawn related whatsoever. But I have seen
Sure.
it play a role,
Okay.
for forage species, but I don't see it play a role directly.
And you know what? That's super interesting, Drew. In our research on the moon, we were focusing mostly on forage that was around the Midwest, and one of
Yeah.
the studies that we found was related to crawfish and moon activity. That there is some degree of trackable behavioral difference with crawfish with the moon, and so that's a great point on prey. Keeping right along, I think Sam's probably going to do this next question on memory.
Yeah. All right. So from episode 7 so far of our podcast, it's all about memory. And there was a study published about specific biomarkers and neuron distribution of different brain regions in the largemouth bass. It brought to light the complex brain system that bass have. They found that in the telencephalon of the bass, there were many nuclei that were functional homologs in other fish that have been studied and were able to learn and remember. So also found in the brain region is oxidative phosphorylation related genes, which were found in high quantities, which indicates that the brain has a high energy output. So the brain is constantly working in a bass. It's telling us that they could have a chance to learn and remember. Also, another study showed us that bass not only have memory, but they're capable of forming associations with negative experiences, like being caught, for example. So do you have any, time on the water where you have found, memory to play into this, or fish's ability to learn? Maybe you in pre-practice, going into a tournament, or you just fun fishing, something like that. Like fish have changed a behavior because you had been there in the past, or something like that.
So in terms of memory, I mean, I think it would be really hard to dispute that bass can remember and can recall occurrences. I think it would be really hard to argue that in terms of suggesting that they can. So they definitely have the ability to remember and recall. I think a major factor that plays in that, from my experience, is when fishing for fish on specific objects. Because if you're fishing for suspended fish, this is really hard to draw the conclusion that a single fish is the same fish.
Right.
But if you're using a single object with a single bass that weighs the exact same as a bass you catch at a later period of time within a reasonable span, but it's something that happens rather often. I say rather often. It's not common, but it's definitely not anywhere near rare for me. There's many times where I'll weigh a fish that I caught.
Interesting.
Okay.
This has never happened on a fishery with water clarity more significant than 3.
Wow.
This has always happened on somewhere with significantly off-colored water. And I think this kind of segues it into something else, but I think bass use visibility and use visual cues to understand what's going on far more than they use any other sense. And just as we do as people, I mean, we use our eyes to navigate our environment more than anything else.
Yeah.
And if a bass cannot, and I think there's also a correlation here in terms of, I don't know whether it's that they can't remember or it's that, in a different scenario, they're willing to play the risks a little bit more aggressively because of the situation they're in. But when fishing for these single fish in these scenarios, this happens far more often for me in water temps that are cooler. Meaning the hotter the water gets, the less this happens. This is something that almost always happens in the winter months and is going to end post spawn. And it does not happen for me in warm water, just doesn't. And I don't know if it's that their brain, because being cold-blooded, I would assume that some level of their metabolism and how their bodies work and that water temperature increasing would play a role in their capabilities, because they do their max speed, their max muscle output is at its highest at warmest water. That I feel like, whenever the water's cooler, I don't know if it's that they can't recall or if it's that they're willing to play the risks a little bit more aggressive because the environment is not super amicable for them to choose to go out and feed on their own. And so they're just kind of, resorting to the options that are in front of them. But this doesn't happen for me in warm water, and this does not happen for me in clean water. It's got to be dirty. It's got to be cooler. But those are the only times where a bass either can't remember or chooses to not care for me. Otherwise, 100%, bass can remember occurrences. He can remember quite well. And he's probably not going to let you make the same trickery succeed on him twice, especially if he can see, especially if the water's warm. From mine.
That is so interesting about your experience with sight, and it lines up. I mean, it just ties the perfect bow on a lot of this research that we've read, talking about how the bass's memory is not locked into like, oh, that's just the lure and I've been hooked by that and I need to stay away from that lure, or that's just the sound of the trolling motor I heard. It's a holistic approach, just like almost like a human would have a memory of, hey, I remember being in that room and what it looked like, what it sounded like, what it smelled like. They are able to form those whole pictures of memory that thing about you and visibility in your experience is wild and really confirms that, which is super exciting. That's crazy interesting. Stuff. You got me writing down episode ideas over here on metabolism. I think that'd be a really interesting one on cold water versus hot water. I think that'd be really interesting.
I would love to see how water temperature and just body function affects their ability to remember in the ranges they're willing to expand, to follow forage, to engage with it, to feed. Because I think, really one thing that we try to attribute, and this is not to get off topic here, but one thing people like to attribute, because there's such a strong crossover between fishing and a lot of people that do other things in the outdoors like hunting, and they like to mold those. And what I think, one thing that's definitely forgotten about, undersold so many times, is you are comparing a warm-blooded creature, often a mammal, to a cold-blooded creature that lives in a totally different environment. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't breathe pure air. It doesn't pull oxygen from air. It pulls oxygen from the water. It lives in this aquatic environment that changes all around it at all times. And this insulating factor that is the water changes how their bodies work throughout the year. And I think one thing is when people make that conclusion, and they draw that association between animals that are land-based and fish, I think they're just kind of reaching. They're trying to draw some positive experience from somewhere else that shouldn't be attributed. And another thing is, most, not to get too far off on that tangent, bass a predator. A lot of things people hunt for on land or prey. And between the predator-prey aspect and the water, the cold-blooded, warm-blooded factor, I don't think there's too many parallels you can draw there. And I think that's something that people probably tread too deep into sometimes. So that's one that I think is pretty undersold, is the fact that they're cold-blooded and their bodies change depending on time of year, water temperature.
So following up, next topic here is from our episode 2, which was on scent and taste. Okay, and I know that it seems to be that this topic is growing in popularity in the industry. At least it seems that way to me. We did read a study that was titled "An Experimental Test of In-Season Homing Mechanisms Used by Nest Guarding Male Largemouth Bass Followed by Displacement," that was conducted by an individual named Catherine DeFora in 2015. Now, this study revealed and solidified what I think maybe a lot of people had thought or guessed, which is that bass have an incredibly strong sense of smell and are able to use that smell to associate certain experiences with favorable and non-favorable outcomes, kind of like what we talked about with memory. So, big question then is, what role, if any, does scent play in your tournament fishing, and do you believe that it makes a difference? Some guys swear by it, some guys don't, I think, talk about it at all. We want to know what your thought is.
Okay, so this is kind of where we stray from really science as science to science as applied in tournament fishing.
Okay.
And science as applied in attacking a bass with an artificial lure. Meaning, I do believe that scent plays a role.
Okay.
However, most of the baits with integrated scent concepts have to have a different plastic formula than others to achieve that goal. Which means that most of the time you sacrifice some level of profile or some facet of action to receive that scent or that smell factor.
Sure.
And because of how strongly I believe vision is the most powerful resource a bass has to feed, and that from most of my interactions I watch on the water, most of the time a bass has his mind made up before he ever reaches my bait. Most, not all, but most of the time he has his mind made up before he ever reaches my bait. And so when it comes to percentages and taking this and applying it to a tournament, I am going to choose action and profile over scent as a dominating factor. And until companies and tackle companies are able to produce baits that can maintain the same action and profile but still have those positive scent markers, I'm going to play the vision card over the scent card. If I could get a bait that had certain scent or certain smell factors integrated into it that still maintains the same action and profile of baits that don't play that role, and that have different plastic formulas, I'm mostly going to lean on the ones that are profile and action based first, until we can get that integrated seamlessly where it doesn't change the plastic formula. Because
Okay.
the companies, I mean, just to rattle off, I mean, you talk about, you've got what, the ones that play it really heavily in terms of integration.
Yeah.
You got like the Maxent
Yeah.
products. You've got with Big Bite, we've got Sensation, and there's, I mean, you talk about, you go across the scheme of plastics in the industry. Like, people have their own integration
Sure.
processes, but
Yeah.
every single time that there is a high scent emphasis bait made, some supplication is made in the plastic material itself, because you
Right.
can't integrate that scent effectively and get it to do the proper
Disperse.
amount of
Right.
dispersion, with the traditional plastic formulas that are required for maximum action and maximum realism, in my opinion.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So to play devil's advocate a little bit then, what's your stance then on product that would go on after the plastic is made? You know, like there stuff that you could like put on or wipe on or powder or
oils,
stuff like that. Do you
chapstick
think
bait, like type
yeah,
stuff.
do you think that it scent plays a big enough role scientifically to compel you in certain circumstances to consider using that, or are you still want to focus on action, and maybe in this instance it'd probably be more of just a visual thing, just on how the bait look?
So this is kind of, again, it comes down to like a tournament application thing for
Sure,
me.
sure.
So mathematically, if I'm going to fish a certain presentation, let's say it's a jig, and I'm going to make X amount of casts over a 10-minute span. On average, when I've used, whether it be powder, oils, any scent that I'm applying to a bait, most of the time I'm giving it, not, it's not really about number of casts, it's about time that it spends in the water for me. And so if that bait's going to spend anywhere from 3.5, 4 minutes in the water, I'm going to have to reapply. It takes me approximately, let's say, most of the time to reapply that in the way that I would want to. It's going to take me somewhere in the 20 to 27, 28-second range,
Oh, wow.
is about how much time it's going to take to
Yeah.
reapply it in the way that
Yeah.
I'd want to. Meaning, we're getting full coverage of the bait. We're focusing on the points that don't move, to where the bait can, the oils or the salts, whatever it may be, can stick to the bait and stay there. Focus on the places where it's protected from that water flowing over the bait, and not washing it away. And so to apply it properly, it's going to take that amount of time. So that means in that 10-minute span, I'm going to have to do that at least twice. You do that over, I guess, 12 minutes, I'm going to have to do it 3 times. That is about probably, I'll just say safe, a minute, that I'm taking every 12 minutes, meaning we extrapolate that across the entire day. I've got 5 12-minute segments every hour across a 7-hour day. We're talking about, what is that, 35 times that I'm going to do that across the course of the day. That's 35 minutes of my fishing day. If I believe that, and just to put some numbers to this, I think that for the most part, especially in conditions where I am choosing this, meaning in dirty water, it doesn't play as much of a role for me, because in dirty water, I don't find that I struggle to make them bite regardless of what scent's on my bait. It's about
Yeah.
putting a bait in front of them. But in clean water, when I think it can play a role, because fish are a lot more curious and they're willing to follow even if they're not committed, I still think in those scenarios, most of the time for me, those fish, those committals that I get, about high 80, low 90% of the bites that I get, I believe that I have gotten that bite before the fish actually eats my bait. I feel like I've gotten that commitment before
Okay.
the fish ever gets up on.
Sure.
And so in that grand scheme, meaning to generate, let's say, I'd say out of those ones that I didn't get to commit, or didn't get to commit quicker, I really don't feel like scent in more than half of those cases would have made an impact. Meaning
Okay.
that, let's say, that remaining 8 to 12%, we split that in half. We're talking a remaining 4 to 6% of all the bites that I got, it may have made an impact. But that 35 minutes is far too significant of a period of time when we're talking about a day that is, essentially 14 of those segments long. That means I'm willing to trade, um, I'm willing to make that supplication
Sure.
for
Sure.
that period of my day, and I just don't think it's worth that. I don't think
Okay.
that
Totally.
4%, just math wise, 4% is not a 14th of my day.
Yeah.
So if that proportion of my day outweighs, and we've gotten so far into the math weeds here that I feel like I'm giving a little bit up.
It's science of the strike, baby.
Hey, it's as far as that goes, that's something I really apply a lot is of the numbers I can do, meaning I cast in front of a bass, I watch what he does, and I draw a conclusion. I keep pretty meticulous track in my mind across a day just to where I can apply that. I'm just crunching numbers, baby. Every time I have a situation come up where I can change the way I'm doing things, I'm going to make a few attempts with a change. I'm going to see what percentage of change it made, if any at all. And I'm going to take those numbers and compare them to the numbers of if I didn't make the change, what efficiency increase would I get? And if the effectiveness increase does not outweigh the efficiency decrease, I'm not going to do it.
Totally
Yeah,
So
understand.
makes sense.
that's a really long answer, but I feel like it's the most comprehensive one for the question that was presented.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And for guys like Sam and I who aren't anywhere remotely close to any level that you've ever been on, that we don't have to worry about that time. And so to the lay person, what I'm hearing you say is it might be worth scientifically to put that stuff on if you want, but when it comes down, if you're under the gun with time, mathematically, it just is not worth it.
Meaning, across the grand scheme of experiences, meaning
Yeah.
maybe not in your specific instance, but I'm not playing specific instances. I'm
Right.
playing grand scheme.
Right. Right.
Because I'm applying grand scheme knowledge every time I make a cast. I'm not trying to play specific instances, because if I'm always playing devil's advocate in my mind, I can't focus on the important
For sure.
factors that are high percentage. It's all, I mean, it's like you're playing a big poker game. I'm just playing my odds. I'm playing odds all day long, and if I pick the strongest odds I can, my chances of success in a tournament are higher than they would be if I was taking risks, making different bets and decisions in the tournament that might not be based purely on percentages and odds.
Totally makes sense.
So let's apply this to somebody that's fun fishing. If you're going out and you are fishing your local lake, and you know that there likely is going to be a population of fish spawning, and you have a very above average population in terms of average size that's on bed, and you're going out with the one thing in mind, that's I want to catch the biggest one I can catch, I think scent plays a role.
Okay.
And I would try to play it. But in a tournament scenario, when I'm trying to generate as many bites as possible across a given period of time, I'm not going to play it. And it's just because my goal is different than theirs.
100%.
But if we're just getting down to the science of how a bass acts, scent does play a role.
All right, so we're running a little low on time. I want to move on to maybe this might end up being our last question here with you, Drew. It's another question that I think comes to mind not only for anglers who are experienced, but especially for people who are maybe new to the sport of bass fishing. We want to make sure we're answering questions for both types of people. So episode 1, the first one we did, we talked about a study by a guy named Frank A. Brown that was titled "The Response of Largemouth Black Bass to Colors," as well as the big study called "Seeing Red: Color Vision in Largemouth Bass." So those studies revealed that largemouth have dichromatic vision and have been scientifically found to be more capable and more keenly aware of two primary colors, which are red and green, and have a disability to see certain colors, which is blue. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that fish can't see the color blue necessarily. I'm saying that it does not appear to them like it would a human. And so I want to ask you, understanding that and knowing that bass do see colors in different ways, how does that play into your time on the water, your tournament prep, or anything like that?
I'm going to be honest, man. In terms of color selection, really what I'm concerned about is obviously we perceive a greater span of the traditional spectrum than a bass can. But that being said, those same factors in the pigment of whatever it is skin, whether it be a shad, a bluegill, a crawfish, those same chemicals that make the pigment of their skin look the way it does operate regardless of what you perceive. The color that they are is the color that they are. And whether a bass can actually perceive that color in the way we perceive it, what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to emulate the color that I don't care what it looks like to them. I want to look like, not necessarily just like, but I want to keep my colors in what I would call the believable range, is
Okay.
just kind of how I
Sure.
describe it to myself.
Yeah.
I want to attack meaning I'm going to establish, when I go to a lake, I'm going to establish the three primary forage species, whether it be shad, bluegill, crawfish, whether it be shad, alowife, and dragonflies, whatever it may be. I'm going to establish the three things that I think are, in terms of forage population. I'm not just talking about like how many bass did I catch that spit up this or that. What's present in the fishery, and see if I can draw some sort of conclusion of what is a commonality in tone amongst all of those things. And I'm just going to try and keep my bait in the believable.
Okay.
I want to operate within a natural expectation of what a bass is going to anticipate seeing in the water, that is alive, that possesses energy that they can capture by consuming it. Meaning, I'm just trying to play into what is believable. I'm not trying to play into what they specifically can or can't
Sure.
discern
Sure.
in terms of
Sure.
the spectrum.
Sure. So more natural to given that water clarity, that that full picture like you were talking about. You're more sticking to matching the hatch than anything. Is that accurate?
100%.
Okay. Okay. Drew, we're not quite out of time yet, but we're getting there, and I don't want to maybe ask a question and go over.
Hey,
And
dude, if you got another question, go for it.
well, we've got a lot.
We got them listed out.
Yeah,
here,
we could talk to you all night, but so I guess I'll ask one more here that we've got. So, and this kind of maybe bleeds into a little bit what we were talking about. So, episode 4, we did all on crawfish. It sounds like you take a significant amount of time to understanding the prey of the lakes, or the forage of the lakes that you're fishing at, and we're trying to slowly trickle out information regarding specific or most popular prey species. And so that's what this episode was. We had a study that was that we read, that was done by a woman named Elizabeth Renner in 2022, that was titled "The Disentangling the Ecological Role of Gizzard Shad in Kansas Small Impoundment Food Webs, Changing the Limnology, Fish Communities, and Predatory Diets, and After Retinone Manipulation." So that's a mouthful, and also want to acknowledge that this study was definitely conducted in smaller impoundments in lakes here in Kansas. So a limited test for sure. Now, one of the primary and most interesting findings of this study, however, was that the largest class of bass that she was recording in those impoundments, they had all their stomachs tested. And out of any other prey type available to these fish in just this study, crawfish was the number one prey species for those larger fish. And that these lakes had gizzard shad in them, had all different kinds of things. Around the industry, the famous saying is, jigs catch pigs. When you are out there on the water and you are in a pinch, or you're trying to catch that kicker, that big one, what are you reaching for? Are you reaching for that crawfish? Or that jig? Or do you have experience that would suggest that those bigger fish typically will go after a jig? Or are you going for something like a big glide or something like that?
So for me, it just depends on the type of fishery we're in. So I think a lot of what a bass preys upon really plays. It definitely has to play within the limits of where is a bass willing to live. Meaning, if where a bass is willing to live and what environment it needs to be able to feed effectively, and the habitat that forage species uses for it to feed effectively, if there's overlap there, there's going to be a major opportunity for them for predation. So, I really think it really matters a lot what the environment is. Meaning,
Yeah.
you talk about lakes like you talk about lakes in the Carolinas. Those places have a significant, in places, a significant crawfish population. And they do use it when those bass occur in those areas. But I don't know that a bass is going out seeking to live where the forage lives always.
Sure.
I think
Yep.
there's times where a bass lives where it lives based on the way that the environment forces it to, and it takes advantage of what's available to it in that scenario.
Yeah.
Meaning that, whenever those fish are present in the areas, allow them to feed on crawfish, they do. But when you get out there and you get over um, those great big basins, you get over those ditches and things of that nature. If that environment sets up in a way that allows the bass to live out there and they are living out there, they aren't going elsewhere to seek some other forage. They're going to feed on the herring that are present, or fish that are using those basins, using those main volumes of in a fishery, are going to feed on the bait fish that are present. So for me, to be honest, I do play the bottom quite a bit, but it's seasonal.
Okay.
Meaning I'm going to play the bottom very, just from my experience of, like, this is kind of where the science of bass and bass catching kind of have to pick a direction.
Yeah.
Because what bass do and how you got to fish to catch a bass are two different things for sure. For one factor or another, I think with one thing that plays a big role is because of my belief that bass use vision so heavily, and that oftentimes their decision is made before they ever reach my bait. Whenever I use a presentation that is above them and that is bait fish oriented, and they are engaging with that bait from a distance, and oftentimes at a high rate of speed, I can get a bass to commit to my bait before it ever gets to it. And so, regardless of the realism of my bait, if I can get that fish to generate enough speed and get committed enough at a distance, then the realism up close doesn't play as much of a factor because he's already got his mind made up before he gets it. And it's a lot harder to change that behavior once they're in that mode of that's food, I'm going to kill it. Versus with baits on the bottom, oftentimes I'm not fishing those baits to try and drop it on their head and catch them off guard, because if I'm trying to make an appeal to a bass in a sense of my bait is a crawfish, I don't want that bait to come falling in 20 feet of water from dead above that fish's head, where it
Sure.
comes up and looks at it 7 feet above the bottom.
Sure.
And so what's going to happen is I'm going to throw that bait out there. I'm going to drag it to that fish. And once it gets there, that engagement probably will be a lot shorter in distance. And so that fish is not going to have to build up as much speed to close that gap. And so what's going to happen is that fish, the ball's a little bit more in his court, and he can go down and investigate a little bit more before he ever makes that decision. And oftentimes, I think the realism with our baits on the bottom in terms of how they act related to a crawfish fall very short in comparison to the realism of our baits that appeal to bait fish, eating fish.
Yeah.
And so I think with fish on the bottom, although crawfish do play a big role, I think our baits overall, in terms of impersonating how a crawfish acts, just from the sheer fact that we spend far less time watching how crawfish move in the water
Yeah.
and how they live
Yep.
than bait fish,
Yep.
our baits just fall really short in terms of accurately representing what a
Sure.
crawfish does in the water.
Super interesting
And
way of looking
so,
at that.
in terms of catching bass, really I lean bait fish more than anything, because I think our tools to catch bait fish oriented bass are far more advanced than our tools to catch a bass that eats crawfish.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
That's my perspective on it from a bass catching point of view.
Wow. Wow. Well, hey, Drew, we want to be
Awesome.
respectful of your time. Thank you so much for joining. Before we
Sure,
kind
guys.
of wrap up the episode, is there anything that you feel like as it relates to the science of the sport of bass fishing that the listeners need to hear, or something that you think people need to look at? Any parting things to leave with our listeners?
I was really appreciative of you guys having me on tonight, because this is a really cool opportunity, and I think you guys are doing something really cool with this podcast. Because what this is you guys take, and one thing I appreciate from watching clips, listening to the podcast a little bit, you take an objective look at it. You are taking numbers and data and focusing on what has been observed, not what has been thought or what has been pondered or what has been mulled over in January sitting inside someone's house.
That's the
You
truth.
you take what has been observed and you try to draw a connection between that and what bass do. And I really appreciate that. And I think that's something like that I really, if I could tell a younger version of me, or somebody at home that's just listening that wants to catch more bass, and wants to know more about what they do, take an objective look at it. Just look at it in terms of observations and occurrences. Use numbers and just go out and do stuff, regardless of what you're doing, regardless whether you're fishing shallow, deep, whether you're fishing fast, slow, whatever. Look at those occurrences, look at those opportunities to learn, and don't try to force what you want to learn on it. Just go out there and
Yeah, it's the
watch what
biggest
happens.
thing.
Observe, just observe. And if you observe with an open mind, there's a lot to learn.
That's awesome, man. Hey, well,
Yeah.
thanks so much again.
Appreciate
And
it.
for all those listening, we appreciate it. Make sure if you're not already, go follow Drew on social media. It's fun to watch this guy, all the journeys that he's taken. Drew, stay here in the studio here for a second. Once we stop recording, we just want to say thanks again. But hey, for our listeners, thank you so much for listening. That's a wrap on episode 10 with Drew Gill. We'll be back hopefully shortly with episode 11. So thanks so much for listening, everyone.
See you guys.
See you guys.